Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the absolute roller coaster of a legacy left by a legendary Belfast shipyard that literally changed maritime engineering forever. We're talking about a company that built the most famous ships in human history, somehow survived multiple wars, faced catastrophic financial declines, and yet, against all odds, has managed to reinvent itself for the modern world. This is the incredibly resilient story of Harland and Wolff. You know, when you think of Victorian shipbuilding, you probably picture a very specific scene, right? Billowing smoke, heavy iron, massive, luxurious ocean liners. But what if I told you that the very same engineering pedigree that birthed the RMS Titanic is now actively out there building 21st century renewable energy infrastructure, like offshore wind farms? Okay, let's dive into this, because bridging the gap between those two wildly different eras is just a fascinating journey of industrial adaptation. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with Section 1, the men behind the yard. Then Section 2, giants of the sea. Section 3 covers wars, troubles, and decline. And finally, Section 4, navigating a new era. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the men behind the yard, a strict visionary and his partners. So every massive empire has to start with a single visionary. And for this story, that's Edward James Harland. Back in 1854, this young, totally uncompromising engineer arrived in Belfast to manage a struggling shipyard on Queen's Island. Harland brought a passion for strict management to absolutely everything he touched, and it worked. He turned things around so quickly that just 4 years later, in 1858, he actually bought the yard outright for £5,000. By 1861, he brings on his former personal assistant, a brilliant German-born engineer named Gustav Wilhelm Wolff, as a full partner. And just like that, Harland and Wolff was officially born. Now, Harland was famous, or maybe infamous, for improving workmanship by being incredibly strict. I mean, the guy walked around carrying a piece of chalk and an ivory ruler just to mark mistakes, and he absolutely banned smoking on the job. No exceptions. There's this fantastic anecdote from an employee that perfectly captures his ruthless style. The worker recalled that Harland had an all-smelling nose, as well as an all-seeing eye. He literally sniffed out a saw pit, lifted a hidden trapdoor, and caught a wizened little man hiding down there in the sawdust, puffing on a clay pipe. You just couldn't get anything past him. In 1874, the duo recruited a former apprentice named William James Pyrie to join them as a partner. Pyrie was this master negotiator. He was the guy who went out and actually found the buyers. When asked how the three of them operated together, Harland famously joked, "Well, Wolff designs the ships, Pyrie sells them, and I smoke the firm's cigars." And this brilliantly illustrates the dynamic that drove their explosive success. It's a perfect reminder of why surrounding yourself with partners who complement your weaknesses is pretty much the ultimate business cheat code. Moving right along to Section 2, Giants of the Sea, revolutionizing maritime architecture. With their management trio locked in, they started translating all those skills into world-changing innovations. They essentially took the rulebook for standard wooden ships of the era, wooden upper decks, rounded hulls, and just threw it out the window. Harland replaced those wooden upper decks with iron, which vastly increased the structural strength. He also completely redesigned the hulls to have a flatter bottom and squarer cross sections. This dramatically increased how much cargo they could hold. They were so visually distinctive, these long, narrow, flat-bottomed ships, that they affectionately became known as Bibby's coffins, named after one of their very first major clients, the Bibby Line. Now, this kind of structural innovation quickly caught the attention of Thomas Henry Ismay over at the White Star Line, forging a legendary relationship between the two companies. This partnership ultimately culminated in the early 20th century with the Olympic-class trio. We're talking the RMS Olympic, the world-famous RMS Titanic, and the HMHS Britannic. The sheer scale of these ocean liners was so totally unprecedented that Harland and Wolff actually had to commission a massive twin slipway and this colossal steel structure known as the Aurole Gantry, literally just to have the physical capacity to build them. Which brings us to Section 3, Wars, Troubles, and Decline, the 20th Century Crucible. Now, what's really interesting about this number is the sheer, mind-boggling scale it represents. 35,000. As the company moved deeper into the 20th century, they expanded to shipyards in Glasgow, Liverpool, and London. And during the Second World War, their workforce peaked at roughly 35,000 people. They were an absolute powerhouse of production for the war effort, churning out everything from aircraft carriers and cruisers to tank and artillery components. But as we'll see, this century also brought some devastating external and internal pressures that would test the very foundations of the company. Because that wartime peak, it came at a really heavy cost. During the Belfast Blitz in April and May of 1941, the Luftwaffe heavily bombed the Queen's Island Yard. The attacks caused massive damage to the shipbuilding facilities and completely leveled their aircraft manufacturing subsidiary, Short and Harland Limited. Yet, and this is almost unbelievable, despite the overwhelming destruction around them, they actually sped up production. They still managed to turn out 6 aircraft carriers, cruisers like the HMS Belfast, and 131 other naval ships before the war ended. We also have to objectively address the internal social pressures that deeply impacted the yard over the decades. Historically, Harland and Wolff had a long-standing reputation as a Protestant closed shop. The historical records from our sources show that during periods of severe political instability in Ireland, Catholic workers, socialists, and labor activists were routinely expelled from their jobs. Documented instances of these workplace expulsions occurred in June 1898, July 1912, during the Troubles in Ulster in the 1920s, and later again in 1970 when 500 Catholic workers were expelled from the yard. Following the war, the company was hit by some fierce economic headwinds. The golden age of booming demand from massive ocean liners absolutely collided with a harsh post-war reality. By the late 1950s, the rise of the commercial jet airliner meant the demand for ocean liners just plummeted. Combine that sudden drop in demand with intense, highly efficient competition from the booming Japanese shipbuilding industry, and traditional British shipbuilding was forced into a very painful contraction. It's a brutal lesson in industry disruption, right? No matter how big your empire is, technological shifts will force you to adapt or die. Remember that wartime peak of 35,000 workers we talked about? Well, by the time we look at the employee count in 2023, that number had dropped to just 800. Let that sink in for a second. 35,000 down to 800. It's a stark, powerful contrast that really highlights the massive systemic decline of the traditional heavy shipbuilding industry over the last few decades. And that leads us into our final section, Section 4, Navigating a New Era, the Fight for Survival. So how exactly does a 160-year-old institution facing these kinds of total industry collapses keep its doors open? Well, it pivots. So the crucial point is that Harland and Wolff fundamentally shifted its business model. They stepped back from pure traditional shipbuilding and heavily diversified. Today, they focus on 5 modern sectors: defense, energy, cruise and ferry repair, renewables, and commercial services. They've assembled offshore wind turbines, built commercial tidal stream turbines, and focused heavily on ship repair and offshore construction. Talk about a pivot. They evolved from building the Titanic to building the infrastructure for marine-generated electricity. A major part of this modernization actually kicked off back in the late 1960s and 70s, and it left a permanent mark on the city. You really can't talk about Harland and Wolff without mentioning the massive gantry cranes, Goliath, built in 1969, and Samson, built in 1974. They literally dominate the Belfast skyline to this day. These cranes have become enduring symbols of the city, representing both the glorious, massive scale of the yard's past and its ongoing heavy-lifting engineering capabilities in the present. But listen, even with all that diversification, the last few years have been a chaotic financial roller coaster. In August 2019, the unthinkable happened. They ceased trading and entered administration. Luckily, they were thrown a lifeline by an energy firm called Infrastrata, which actually sparked this phase of aggressive expansion. Between 2020 and 2021, the newly invigorated company acquired the Appledore Shipyard and 2 bifab yards in Scotland. But that rapid growth heavily strained their finances, forcing a second administration just 5 years later, in September 2024. Finally, the dust settled in January 2025 when the Spanish state-owned shipbuilding company Navantia completed its purchase of Harland Wolff, officially retaining all the employees across its 4 shipyards. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. Through strict Victorian management, devastating wartime bombings, social upheaval, total industry collapse, and repeated financial administrations, this shipyard has endured it all. Now, with the January 2025 Navantia acquisition seemingly securing its legacy and its workforce, we have to ask, after 160 years of triumphs and trials, is Harland and Wolff finally unsinkable? Thank you so much for exploring this remarkable history with me on This Explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning how the heavyweight industries of our past are going to adapt to our future. Catch you next time.